Imagine, if you will, a really crisp autumn afternoon in the American Midwest.
Best time of the year, honestly.
Right. It's perfect. So
Sure.
you are standing in the middle of this massive stadium tailgate, and you're just surrounded by tens of thousands of screaming, energized fans.
Just a sea of team colors.
Exactly. It's college football Saturday. You've got the smell of barbecue in the air. The marching bands are warming up in the distance, and the energy is just absolutely electric.
Like you can feel it in your chest.
Yes. But if you pay really close attention, there is this undercurrent to the noise here that feels, I don't know, a little different than your average run-of-the-mill sports rivalry.
It's a little sharper.
Yeah, it feels legitimately a bit dangerous, like visceral.
Oh, for sure.
So you turn to the fan standing next to you, right, and their face is totally painted. They're screaming at the opposing team's bus as it pulls in. And you ask them, like, why they hate this specific rival so much.
And you'd expect them to talk about sports.
Right. You expect them to mention a bad call from last season, or maybe a coach who jumped ship, or some recruiting violation.
It's just standard sports stuff.
Exactly. But instead, they look you dead in the eye, and they cite a 150-year-old massacre.
It's wild. It really is.
It's insane. They talk about towns being burned to the ground. They talk about innocent people being dragged from their beds and slaughtered.
While wearing foam fingers.
Right. In the middle of a tailgate, holding a plastic cup of beer, they are legitimately invoking the most brutal, localized, neighbor-on-neighbor conflict in American history to justify their absolute hatred for the other team's quarterback.
It is just a completely surreal juxtaposition. I mean, taking the unimaginable blood-soaked horrors of 19th century guerrilla warfare and, translating them into face paint and stadium chants.
It makes no sense.
It feels like a glitch in how we process history,
Well,
but that is exactly the phenomenon we're looking at today.
And I am so fascinated by this because we are diving into a history that feels, on paper, incredibly distant, but weirdly, aggressively present in the culture.
It's still bleeding into the modern day.
Pun intended, I guess.
Yeah.
Because we are looking at a brilliant collection of historical essays titled Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri, The Long Civil War on the Border. It's edited by Jonathan Earl and Diane Muddy Burke.
It's a fantastic collection.
It really is. And for those of you listening who are eager to, bypass the endless information overload and get straight to the core of how history actually shapes the ground we walk on today, you are in the exact right place.
Absolutely. So our mission for this deep dive is to trace the full, devastating arc of what historians call the Long Civil War.
The Long Civil War, not just the standard 4 years.
Right, because to really understand it, we have to look at the entire life cycle of the conflict. So we're going to start way back in the 1820s, looking at the early settlement of the border and the quiet, deeply ingrained establishment of small-scale slavery there.
Right, the seeds being planted.
Exactly. And from there, we'll see how those early seeds sprouted into the absolute madness of full-scale guerrilla warfare in the 1850s and 60s.
The total war phase.
Yeah, the really dark stuff. And finally, we will explore the post-war era. We need to understand how these completely fractured societies attempted to rebuild themselves.
Because they had to keep living next to each other.
They did. And we'll look at how they ultimately sublimated this incredibly bloody, traumatic history into the modern college sports rivalries you were just describing.
Okay, that sounds like quite a journey. Now, before we jump into the timeline, I do need to add a quick but, essential note for our listeners.
A very necessary disclaimer.
Right, because the material we are covering today involves deeply charged political and social history. I mean, we're talking about the institution of slavery, horrific racial violence, and fiercely divided loyalties.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. So this deep dive is going to remain strictly impartial. We are here to report on the factual content, the data, and the historical arguments presented in our sources.
We aren't taking any sides.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any specific historical viewpoints over others.
Yeah.
Our goal is simply to help you, the listener, understand the ideas, the mechanics, and the actual events contained in the original source material.
Because history is rarely neat, right? And this specific history is about as messy, complex, and controversial as it gets.
Muddy waters, for sure. So let's start wading into them.
Let's do it.
To understand why the border between Kansas and Missouri eventually exploded into unprecedented violence, we can't start at the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861.
No, that's way too late.
Right. If we start there, we miss the entire foundation. We have to rewind decades earlier. We need to go to the muddy banks of the Missouri River in the 1820s.
The very beginning of the state.
So who is actually packing up their wagons and settling this western frontier? Like, what kind of economic and social world are they building from scratch out there?
Well, to understand the people, we have to look at the migration patterns right after the War of 1812. There is this massive, surging flood of settlers pushing west, and the people who end up settling in the western river counties of Missouri, they are predominantly from the Upper South.
When you say Upper South, you mean?
We're talking about places like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia.
Got it.
And when these settlers moved, they didn't just bring their plows and their livestock, they brought their entire cultural framework with them.
Which included slavery.
Yes, a vital foundational pillar of that Upper South culture was the institution of slavery. But it's really critical to understand that the system they built in Missouri looked very different from the system in places like Mississippi or South Carolina.
Right, and the data from the sources actually paints a really surprising picture here.
It usually surprises a lot of people.
Because when we think of American slavery, we naturally default to this image of like a towering oak tree, right? Massive plantations dominating the Deep South, hundreds of enslaved people toiling under this highly centralized, visible system.
Good Gone with the Wind image.
Exactly. But the essay by Kristen K. Epps in our stack breaks down the numbers for the Missouri border, and it's completely different.
Totally different scale.
Roughly 86% of Missouri's enslaved people lived in households with fewer than 20 slaves. And the vast majority of slaveholders owned fewer than 10.
Yeah, that scale completely changes the dynamic. I mean, this was not a plantation economy. It was an economy built around modest farms, local trade, and a deeply localized version of bondage. But, and this is important, we shouldn't mistake small scale for mild.
No, absolutely not.
The economic realities of this system were grueling.
Let's dig into that economic reality, actually. If they aren't managing massive cotton empires, what is the actual engine driving this localized border slavery?
Well, it functioned largely on the backs of enslaved people cultivating hemp and tobacco.
Hemp, like for rope.
Exactly. These were incredibly labor-intensive cash crops. Hemp was essential to the broader national economy at the time. Like you said, it was used for making rope, but also the bagging necessary to wrap the cotton bales down south.
Oh, so it fed directly into the Deep South cotton industry.
Exactly. They were interconnected. And in the antebellum period, hemp grown in the fertile soil of Missouri could sell for up to $170 a ton in eastern markets like Baltimore.
$170 a ton.
Yeah.
In the 1830s.
Yeah, that was a small fortune back then. It was huge money.
Wow. But getting that hemp out of the ground and ready for market, I mean, that's where the physical toll really comes in.
Oh, it was awful work.
Our sources describe these hemp stalks growing, 6 to 8 feet tall?
Yeah, they were massive. And harvesting it without modern mechanized tools was just backbreaking. Enslaved men were expected to go into these dense, towering fields and cut down an acre of hemp a day by hand.
An entire acre.
Yeah, using these heavy scythes. And then the hemp had to be retted.
Retted. What is that?
It basically means left in the fields to rot slightly so the fibers could be separated, and then they had to break it down using heavy wooden handbrakes.
That sounds miserable.
It was. The white settlers migrating from the Upper South viewed this enslaved labor not just as a convenience, but as an absolute economic necessity. Without it, they couldn't capitalize on the lucrative hemp market.
And it wasn't just rural agricultural labor either.
No, not at all.
The sources mentioned the French fur traders, right? Specifically the powerful Chouteau family.
Oh yeah, the Chouteaus. They were operating out of what is now Kansas City in the 1820s and 30s.
So even the fur trade was reliant on this.
Francois and Berenice Chouteau are perfect examples of how deeply ingrained this was. They were the frontier elite. They established these massive fur warehouses right where the Missouri and Kansas rivers meet.
It's just a major hub.
Exactly. And they utilized enslaved labor right there at the bustling crossroads of the frontier. They had people loading cargo, managing the warehouses, doing the heavy lifting of international trade.
There's actually a specific detail in the text that really stuck with me about them.
Oh, about Berenice.
Yeah. Berenice Chouteau purchased an enslaved girl named Nancy, simply to be a domestic attendant and a playmate for her daughter.
Right. Just a companion for her kid.
It really shows how this institution wasn't just, a towering oak of agriculture. It was an invasive, creeping vine.
I like that analogy.
It wrapped itself around the roots of every single frontier industry, from the Chouteau fur warehouses to the hemp fields, all the way into the intimate spaces of the domestic household. It was entangled in the very dirt of this society.
That creeping vine concept really gets right to the heart of the psychological tension that would eventually tear the region apart.
Because it was everywhere but small.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the slave holdings were small and because the system was interwoven into small farms and local businesses right on the edge of the frontier, it created a profound sense of paranoia among white Missourians.
Paranoia because they felt vulnerable.
Exactly. Think about the geography for a second. If you are a massive plantation owner in the middle of Alabama, you have hundreds of miles of slaveholding territory buffering you in every direction.
Right, you're insulated.
Exactly. Your property is relatively secure from outside interference, but if you are a Missouri farmer with 5 enslaved workers, and your farm is situated right on the porous edge of a vast, undefined Western territory,
You're completely exposed.
you are. The system felt incredibly fragile to them.
Which brings us right to the spark that ignites the powder keg. It's 1854, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed.
A huge turning point.
Right, the federal government basically says, okay, we're opening up Kansas territory for settlement. But instead of dictating whether it will be a free territory or a slave territory, they introduce the doctrine of popular sovereignty.
Which is basically passing the buck.
Yeah, it basically means let the settlers figure it out. Whoever moves there gets to vote and decide the laws.
And that legislative decision triggers an immediate existential crisis in Missouri.
Because they're right next door.
Because what happens next? Missourians look across that invisible, porous state line, and they see northern free state settlers flooding in.
It's just pouring over the border.
Right. And these aren't just random farmers looking for land. Many of them are actively backed and funded by organized abolitionist groups from New England.
Like the New England Immigrant Aid Company.
Exactly. They're literally paying people to move to Kansas to vote against slavery.
So for the Missourians, this isn't just a polite political debate over a neighboring state's constitution. They are watching an existential threat build a house right next door.
Precisely. They didn't view these incoming Northerners merely as political rivals at the ballot box. They viewed them as a direct, imminent threat to their economic survival, their property, and their entire social hierarchy.
Because if Kansas goes free,
If Kansas becomes a free state, Missouri is suddenly surrounded on 3 sides by free territory. You've got Illinois to the east, Iowa to the north, and now Kansas to the west.
the creeping vine would be choked out entirely.
That's exactly how they saw it.
So the political temperature just goes from a simmer to an absolute boil. The creeping vine of border slavery meets the unstoppable ideological force of Northern abolitionism.
And something has to give.
Right. And what begins as intense political friction at the ballot box rapidly escalates into a complete breakdown of law and order. As we move from the 1850s into the 1860s, the localized violence just starts to spiral out of control.
The breakdown is staggering, honestly. And it happens much faster than the federal government can comprehend.
Which is a running theme in history, it seems.
Oh, always. As historian Tony Mullis details in his essay, by late 1860, so this is right before the formal Civil War actually begins back east, you have free state guerrillas from Kansas, known as Jayhawkers, moving from political activism to armed insurgency.
These are men like Charles Jennison and James Montgomery, right?
Yes. And they start organizing large-scale operations, like the Southwest Expedition.
What was the Southwest Expedition?
They were essentially leading armed raids across the border into Missouri. They justify it as striking a blow against slavery. And to be fair, they are liberating enslaved people, but they are also stealing horses, looting property, burning farms, and terrorizing the pro-slavery civilian population.
It's a full-on incursion.
It is.
I read the sections on the federal response to this in the book, and it's almost comical how inadequate it was.
It really was.
The federal government tries to stop the cross-border raids, but they treat it like, a local noise complaint or a minor policing issue.
It was a total miscalculation of the reality on the ground. The federal government sends these small detachments of the U.S. Army, like dragoons and cavalry, to try and maintain order.
Well, it doesn't work.
Not even a little. The frontier is vast, the troops are few, and the ideological divide between the settlers is so deep that the Army's presence offers, at best, a flimsy illusion of security.
Because the traditional rule of law had completely evaporated.
Exactly. Because neither the Missourians nor the Kansans respected federal authority or the courts anymore.
They felt the system was broken.
Both sides felt the political and legal systems had completely failed to protect their interests, and when the law fails to protect you, you turn to the rifle.
So the tinderbox is already smoking.
Yeah.
And then, April 1861 hits. Fort Sumter is fired upon in South Carolina. The actual formal civil war begins,
Mm.
and this border region just detonates. According to the sources, it becomes the absolute worst guerrilla theater in American history.
Without question.
But I think what confuses a lot of people is the political status of Missouri during the war. Because Missouri is technically a loyal Union state, right? They don't join the Confederacy.
Legally, yes. The Missouri State Convention votes against secession. It remains in the Union. However, the population itself is completely fractured.
House divided.
Literally. Roughly half of the state harbors deep, fervent secessionist sympathies. So the war in Missouri doesn't look like Gettysburg or Bull Run.
There's no big lines of infantry.
Right. You don't have two traditional uniformed armies lining up in a field, maneuvering with bugle calls. You have a massive federal occupation force trying to suppress a vicious local insurgency, and you have neighbors forming bands to hunt down their neighbors in the woods.
The essay by the late Michael Feldman in our stack uses a phrase that just sent chills down my spine.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
He describes the conflict on the border as a Hobbesian war of all against all.
Yes.
Meaning, society has completely reverted to a state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short. This wasn't a military engagement aimed at capturing strategic territory. It was an endless churning cycle of robbery, arson, torture, and revenge.
Playing out in the woods and the ravines, and because it was so deeply personal, the violence took on a really ritualistic, almost medieval quality.
Medieval's a good word for it.
It wasn't just about killing the enemy combatant, it was about obliterating them, humiliating them, and sending a message of absolute terror.
Right.
Both sides engaged in horrific acts that completely defied the traditional laws of war. We are talking about the mutilation of bodies, the taking of trophies, scalping.
Scalping in the 1860s.
Yes, scalping, and the summary execution of completely unarmed prisoners.
The Centralia Massacre in 1864 really illustrates this brutal reality.
It's one of the darkest days of the entire conflict.
Tell us what happened there.
So, Confederate guerrillas bushwhackers, under the command of Bloody Bill Anderson, they stopped a civilian train in the town of Centralia.
Okay.
They pulled off 24 unarmed Union soldiers who were just on leave heading home. They stripped them of their uniforms and executed them right there.
Just lined them up and shot them.
Yes. But it gets worse. Later that day, when a mounted Union infantry unit tried to pursue them, the bushwhackers ambushed them. They killed over 100 men.
Oh my God.
And then they spent hours scalping and mutilating the corpses on the battlefield.
That level of barbarity is just staggering.
It's hard to even process.
But the sources are very careful to point out that this brutality was absolutely not one-sided. The Union-aligned Jayhawkers from Kansas were committing terrible atrocities of their own.
Oh, absolutely. They were burning out entire counties.
And this brings up a deeply disturbing question about the psychology of the fighters on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
You have this concept in the book of the Crusader mentality.
The Crusader mentality, yeah, that's a crucial psychological framework.
There is a specific example in the text about a Union lieutenant named Sherman Bodwell. And I have to say, I found his diary entries incredibly confusing and disturbing to process.
Bodwell is a really fascinating figure.
He's this devout, highly religious abolitionist from Connecticut, right? He's fighting for human freedom. Yeah. Yet, he writes about horrific violence with this chilling detachment. Like, how does a man fighting a righteous war for freedom justify becoming an absolute zealot?
Lieutenant Bodwell is a vital case study in how ideology just completely overrides human empathy.
Yeah.
He was an educated man, a devout Christian who moved to Kansas specifically to fight for the Free State cause. He served in the 11th Kansas Cavalry.
Okay.
And his diary reveals that he viewed his Confederate guerrilla enemies not just as political opponents or enemy soldiers, but as literal demons.
Like actual supernatural demons.
Yes, subhuman fiends. There's a profound dehumanization there.
There's that one entry where his unit captures a guerrilla.
Right. The captive man is executed with a gunshot to the face.
While unarmed.
Right. And Bodwell isn't horrified by this summary execution. Instead, he writes about his deep regret that he couldn't see the man's face at the exact moment of death.
Which is just so morbid.
It is. He actually asks the officer who fired the shot about it later, because Bodwell wanted confirmation that a shadow had passed over the man's face.
A shadow.
Yes, he wanted proof that this monster soul had plunged straight into hell.
Wow.
Bodwell viewed himself and his men not as soldiers, but as divine instruments of cosmic justice.
And the political leadership completely cheered this on. I mean, Kansas Governor John J. Ingalls proudly referred to Charles Jennison's brutal, looting Jayhawker regiment as destroying angels.
Destroying angels, it's such a loaded term.
Which brings up a philosophical question that I really want the listener to chew on for a second.
Okay, what is it?
These men on the border, the Kansans and the Missourians, they spoke the exact same language.
They did.
They shared the exact same agrarian frontier culture. They read from the exact same Bible and worshiped the exact same Christian God. How does a shared religion and a shared basic humanity fail so completely to maintain even a shred of empathy?
It's a profound question, and I think the sources suggest it comes down to the absolute nature of the stakes they created in their own minds.
The stakes.
Yeah. When you become utterly convinced that your side is aligned with divine will or absolute moral purity, the enemy ceases to be human. They become merely an obstacle to cosmic justice.
Right.
For the Jayhawkers, they were eradicating the demonic, systemic evil of slavery. For the Missouri bushwhackers, they were defending their homes, their property, and their families from invading godless northern tyrants.
So they both think God is on their side.
Exactly. When you frame a conflict as a holy purge, the high, hard wall of antipathy goes up, and human empathy is entirely extinguished.
So we have this vortex of neighbor scalping neighbor violence raging out in the brush.
Right.
But a key insight from these essays is that this violence isn't contained just to the men with rifles.
No, it bleeds into every aspect of life.
Right. When the formal rule of law vanishes and there are no front lines, the home itself becomes a battlefield. The living room and the kitchen become the primary engines of the war.
That's a critical shift in how we understand this conflict. If we look at the logistics of this guerrilla war, the Confederate sympathizing bushwhackers, men like William Quantrill, Bloody Bill Anderson, George Todd, they are fighting an irregular war.
Meaning they don't have a supply chain.
Right. They aren't getting supply trains from the Confederate capital in Richmond. They don't have quartermasters or armories. They are relying entirely on the local civilian population to survive.
Which pulls the civilians right into the crossfire.
Exactly. And specifically, they are relying on Southern sympathizing women for food, ammunition, shelter, intelligence, and clothing.
I am so glad you mentioned clothing, because Joseph M. Byline Jr.'s essay details one of the most surreal, almost macabre elements of this entire conflict.
The guerrilla shirt.
Yes,
Yeah.
the guerrilla shirt. I couldn't stop thinking about this when I read it.
It is a really striking visual detail, isn't it?
It's crazy. Tell the listener what these were.
So the women of Missouri crafted these distinctive, handsome, heavily embroidered overshirts for their men fighting in the brush.
Like intricately designed.
Yes, they weren't standard military issue at all. These shirts featured intricate floral designs, elaborate needlework, and deep pockets specifically designed to hold extra ammunition for their revolvers.
It is just so jarring to visualize. You have this absolutely brutal, dirty, bloody frontier fighting, men executing each other in the mud, scalping each other in the woods. And they are committing these atrocities while wearing lovingly, delicately embroidered garments crafted by their mothers, wives, and sisters.
It's a huge contrast.
It perfectly encapsulates how deeply the domestic, intimate sphere of the home was tied to the slaughter out in the fields. The women were literally stitching the war effort together.
And the Union military commanders eventually realized this.
They caught on.
They realized they were chasing ghosts in the woods. They couldn't defeat the bushwhackers in a traditional fight because the guerrillas would just melt back into the civilian population. They'd hide in their mothers' barns.
Right.
So the Union Army made a strategic shift. They began targeting the female support network.
Which feels like crossing a major line for the 1860s.
It was. They started arresting the wives, sisters, and mothers of known guerrillas, banishing them, or throwing them into makeshift military prisons.
And that strategic shift to target the women leads directly to one of the greatest tragedies and escalations of the entire war.
It set off an uncontrollable chain reaction.
Tell us about the Kansas City prison.
Okay, so in August 1863, several female relatives of prominent guerrillas, including Bloody Bill Anderson's own sisters, were being held in a dilapidated makeshift Union prison in Kansas City.
Right.
And the building was structurally unsound. The Union officers actually knew it was unsafe. And then it collapsed.
While the women were inside.
Yes. Several of the young women inside were crushed to death. And when word of this reached the bushwhackers hiding out in the brush, they were driven absolutely mad with grief and a desire for vengeance.
They felt the rules of engagement had been entirely thrown out the window at that point.
Yes, they believed the Union had intentionally murdered their unarmed female relatives. Therefore, they felt completely justified in slaughtering unarmed Union men in return.
Eye for an eye.
Exactly. Just days after the prison collapse, William Quantrill gathered a massive force of guerrillas and rode across the border into the abolitionist stronghold of Lawrence, Kansas.
The Lawrence Massacre.
Yes. In a matter of hours, they burned the town to the ground and systematically murdered between 150 and 200 unarmed men and boys in front of their family.
The front of their families.
Yes, it was a direct retaliatory escalation of total war.
The cycle of revenge just spinning entirely out of control, pulling absolutely everyone down with it.
Nobody was safe.
But while the white populations of Kansas and Missouri are locked in this apocalyptic death spiral over the issue of slavery, what is actually happening to the enslaved people themselves?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Right. Because the traditional narrative we are so often taught is that enslaved people sort of passively waited for Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation or for the Union Army to march in and free them.
Right, the savior narrative.
Exactly. But the sources here completely dismantle that idea.
Diane Muddy Burke's research in the book is fantastic on this exact point. It highlights how enslaved Missourians actively used the chaos of the guerrilla war to self-emancipate.
They freed themselves.
They did. The system of small-scale slavery we discussed at the very beginning, the creeping vine, it began to wither and crumble.
Why?
Well, because the white masters were either killed in the fighting, or they joined the formal military and went back east, or they were just too distracted by the constant threat of guerrilla violence to enforce the strict slave codes.
The system lost its enforcers.
Exactly. The enslaved population wasn't passive. They saw the cracks in the system, and they forced them wide open.
We have some incredibly specific anecdotes from the text here that just bring this reality to life. Like, there was the story of a man named George Washington.
Oh, George Washington's story is incredible. He was an enslaved man living in Platte County, Missouri.
Okay.
And in the bitter, freezing winter of 1861 to 1862, he saw his opportunity. He quite literally walked out onto the frozen, solid ice of the Missouri River and crossed it on foot to reach the Free State stronghold of Quindaro, Kansas.
Just imagine the sheer desperation, the calculation of risk and the immense courage that takes.
It's unbelievable.
To step out onto a frozen, groaning river in the dead of winter, knowing that if the ice breaks, you freeze and drown. If you are caught by patrols, you might face severe torture or death.
But he did it anyway.
But the promise of freedom on the other bank is worth the risk. It's just an amazing story. And then there is the story of Henry Bruce.
Henry Bruce's story is audacious. I love this one.
Tell us about Henry.
So he was enslaved in Missouri, and he decided to escape with his fiancée. They fled their captors on a stolen horse, managed to elude the armed men pursuing them through the chaotic countryside.
Which was full of guerrillas, remember?
Right. Highly dangerous. And then, as impossible as it sounds, they simply boarded a train on the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad and rode it to freedom in Kansas.
Hiding in plain sight.
Yes, they just bought a ticket and left. And these aren't isolated incidents. Acts of self-emancipation happened by the thousands.
Wow.
Enslaved people were walking off farms, they were joining Union regiments as laborers or soldiers, or they were crossing into Kansas on their own terms.
The book points out that by the time Missouri officially abolishes slavery, which, by the way, didn't happen until January 1865 via a state convention dominated by radical Republicans, the institution was already a ghost.
It was dead on the ground.
The enslaved people had essentially collapsed the system from the inside out by walking away while their oppressors were busy shooting each other.
The legal decree in 1865 was necessary, obviously, but it largely just formalized a reality that African Americans had already forced into existence on the ground through their own agency and courage.
So eventually, the guns fall silent, Appomattox happens, the physical shooting stops.
The war is officially over.
But what does this all mean for the aftermath? How do you stitch a society back together when the people who were formerly considered property are now demanding full political rights?
It's an incredibly tense situation.
And the victors of the war are aggressively rewriting the narrative to make themselves look like heroes.
The post-war environment, the Reconstruction era on the border, is fascinatingly complex and incredibly volatile.
Walk us through it.
Well, you have Black Missourians stepping into the political arena almost immediately. They aren't just content with freedom from bondage, right? They want civic equality.
Like voting rights.
Yes, they formed the state affiliate of the National Equal Rights League to demand suffrage, the right to vote.
And leaders like Henry Bruce, the man who escaped on the train, he becomes a prominent figure in this movement, right?
He does. He leverages his wartime experiences, his organizational skills, and his newfound freedom to really push for the ballot. Black leaders in Missouri were actively demanding a true, functioning biracial democracy.
But the white conservative backlash to this activism was immediate, wasn't it? And it wasn't just confined to angry editorials in the newspaper. It was violently physical.
Highly violent. Former bushwhackers, men like Jim Jackson, they didn't just lay down their arms and become peaceful farmers because a treaty was signed in Virginia.
They kept fighting.
They did. They formed roving gangs that continued to terrorize the countryside, specifically targeting the newly freed black population.
But there is a crucial distinction here between the border violence and the violence happening in the Deep South during Reconstruction, right?
Yes, very important economic distinction. In the Deep South, the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups were using terror to force black people back onto the cotton plantations as a subservient, captive labor force.
Because cotton was still king.
Exactly. But in Missouri, the economic engine had changed.
How so?
While the labor-intensive hemp industry in Missouri had completely collapsed during the war, it was gone.
Oh, because the national market changed?
That, and without the captive labor, they couldn't produce it profitably. So without those specific cash crops, the economic incentive for white Missourians to control a massive captive black labor force was gone.
So what was the goal of the violence then?
The goal wasn't economic exploitation anymore. It was outright expulsion. They wanted the black population gone entirely.
Wow. They just wanted them out of the state.
Yes. This campaign of terror led to mass migrations out of places like Lafayette County, which, prior to the war, had the highest enslaved population in the state.
Where'd they go?
Many black Missourians fled to the relative safety of large cities like St. Louis, or they crossed the border into Kansas.
Which perfectly transitions us to the Kansas side of the border during Reconstruction.
The Promised Land, supposedly.
Right. And the essays in this section completely upend the tidy narrative that most people are taught in grade school.
Oh, they shatter it.
Kansas built its entire post-war identity on being the shining free state. They celebrated their origins as the righteous, moral abolitionist crusaders who stirred up to the evil, slave-holding Missouri border ruffians.
That was the brand.
But the research by Brent M.S. Campney in our sources exposes this free state identity as a deeply hypocritical mythology.
Campney's research is incredibly sobering. It really requires us to look past the branding.
What did he find?
He demonstrates that while white Kansans were loudly celebrating their free state mythology, erecting monuments to their own moral superiority, they were actively engaging in horrific racial violence against the black population that had sought refuge there.
The people who had just fled Missouri.
Yes. His data shows that between 1864 and 1874, white mobs in Kansas lynched at least 33 black men.
33 lynchings in the state that literally bled to keep slavery out.
It's a dark stain on that history.
I think a lot of people assume that because Kansas fought for the Union, it must have been a haven of racial equality. How did white Kansans square that circle? How did they justify this violence while maintaining their good guy image?
The way they justified it is a masterclass in cognitive dissonance and regional deflection.
Deflection.
Yeah. White Kansans weaponized their free state origins as a shield against any criticism. Whenever a lynching occurred, or when towns implemented strict Jim Crow-style segregation, the local newspapers and politicians would engage in this comparative rhetorical game.
Meaning they'd point at someone else.
They would point to the Deep South. They would essentially argue, well, yes, this mob violence is unfortunate, but at least we aren't Alabama or South Carolina. We are the state of John Brown. We fought to end slavery.
Wow. So they use their past to excuse their present.
Precisely. By constantly pointing at the perceived worse systemic racism of the South, white Kansans excused and normalized their own severe localized racial oppression.
It's a staggering historical blind spot. Kansas successfully branded itself as the utopia of freedom. And that brand, that mythology, gave its citizens a psychological free pass.
It let them sleep at night.
Because they believed they were the good guys simply by definition of their state borders. They felt immune to the reality that they were engaging in the exact same racial violence they so loudly condemned across the state line in Missouri.
It shows how incredibly powerful historical branding really is.
And that concept of branding sets the stage perfectly for how this entire conflict, the guerrilla war, the massacres, the racial violence, is eventually remembered, packaged, and commercialized.
Because history isn't static.
No, history isn't just an objective record of what happened. It's a reflection of the stories people choose to tell about what happened in order to serve their current needs.
Absolutely.
Which leads us directly into the final era of our deep dive. Memories, monuments, and mascots. The invention of the border war.
This is where it gets really weird.
It does. How did the trauma of the 1860s, where neighbors were literally scalping neighbors and towns were being burned to ash, how does that eventually evolve into a tailgate party and a lucrative marketing slogan of the 21st century?
Well, the transition doesn't happen overnight. It happens very unevenly, and it requires a massive amount of selective memory.
Right.
In Missouri, for instance, you see the rise of the Quantrill Men reunions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
The Quantrill Men reunion.
Yeah. Former guerrillas, the men who rode with Quantrill and Anderson, would gather annually for picnics, speeches, and group photos.
A reunion for bushwhackers.
Yeah.
For guys who committed the Lawrence Massacre.
Yes. And in these spaces, they completely sanitized their history. They actively ignored the atrocities, the scalping, the execution of unarmed men, and the Lawrence Massacre.
How do they spin it?
They spun a narrative that celebrated themselves as noble, chivalric defenders of the lost cause. Men who were merely protecting their homes and their women from brutal northern invaders.
Wow.
They turned a vicious, dirty insurgency into a romanticized myth.
And obviously, the Kansans across the border who had survived the Lawrence Massacre, who had seen their fathers and brothers murdered, were deeply horrified and disgusted by these celebrations.
Oh, they were furious. The wounds were still incredibly raw.
But as the decades passed and the actual veterans died off, that intense regional animosity needed a new outlet. It couldn't be fought with rifles anymore. Enter college football.
The great sublimator of regional tension.
The University of Kansas, the Jayhawks, and the University of Missouri, the Tigers, played their first football game in 1891.
It's actually the oldest division, a college football rivalry west of the Mississippi River.
And here is the massive reveal from Jennifer Elvever's essay in our sources. The intense, visceral hatred that fans feel today, the idea that the sports rivalry is just a continuous, unbroken chain of blood feud animosity extending straight out of the Civil War.
It's mostly made up.
It is largely a modern invention. It is a manufactured marketing gimmick.
It is truly surprising when you look at the primary sources from the era. If you look at the early days of the sports rivalry, from the 1890s all the way to the 1950s, the games were certainly competitive, but they were generally civil, polite, and sportsmanlike.
So no one was bringing up the 1860s.
Barely at all. Early newspaper coverage of the football games barely even mentioned the Civil War. The coaches praised each other's tactics. It was a standard regional sports rivalry. The deep historical hatred was dormant.
So if it was just a normal football game for 60 years, when does the history get weaponized? Like, who decides to bring the bloodshed back into the stadium?
The shift really starts happening in the 1970s and 80s.
That recent.
Yeah, and it's largely driven by football coaches looking for an emotional edge to motivate their players. A key figure in this cultural shift is the University of Kansas football coach Don Fambro.
Okay, what did he do?
He was legendary for giving his players these incredibly fiery, aggressive, and entirely historically inaccurate pep talks before they played Missouri.
Inaccurate how?
Well, for instance, he would tell his players that William Quantrill, the guerrilla who burned Lawrence to the ground, went to school at Mizzou.
Which he didn't. Quantrill was a school teacher from Ohio.
He absolutely did not go to Mizzou. But Fambrew didn't care about the historical accuracy of his speeches. He cared about the emotional response he was getting from his 19-year-old linebackers.
He wanted them angry.
He was using a bastardized comic book version of history to stoke rage and adrenaline on the gridiron. And it worked. The players got fired up, the fans loved the drama, and eventually the sports media began to eat it up and broadcast it.
Because from a broadcasting perspective, it is a fantastic story. It adds epic, life-or-death stakes to a Saturday afternoon game. It's not just a football game anymore, it's a continuation of the Civil War.
It's those tickets.
And by the 1990s, the universities themselves realized there was a massive amount of money to be made here. In 2002, the two schools officially capitalized on this historical narrative by branding their athletic series the Border War.
They trademarked it.
They secured corporate sponsors. They sold thousands of branded T-shirts. They quite literally monetized the memory of a conflict that killed thousands of their ancestors.
And it's fascinating how the public reacted when the universities tried to walk it back later on.
Oh, right, after 9/11.
Yeah, there was a brief moment of hesitation right after the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. University officials felt that using the word war to market a sports game was too insensitive given the national climate.
Which makes sense.
So they briefly changed the name of the rivalry to the Border Showdown.
But the fans absolutely hated it. They thought Showdown sounded too soft, too corporate, like a tame Western movie.
They did. The public pushback was immense. The fans wanted the blood and guts history, or at least this sanitized, commercially viable, sporty version of it. They wanted the identity that came with being part of a war.
Right.
The animosity became so culturally embedded, so deeply felt by the fan bases, that real-world politics actually started echoing the sports world.
Tell them about Osceola.
So in 2011, the town of Osceola, Missouri, which had been viciously sacked and burned by Kansas Jayhawkers in 1861, they actually passed a formal municipal resolution demanding that the University of Kansas drop the Jayhawk name.
They passed a law.
A resolution, yeah. They argued that by using the Jayhawk mascot, the university was glorifying domestic terrorists.
That is just wild to me. The lines between a 19th century bloodbath, municipal politics, and a 21st century athletic conference completely dissolved.
They bled right into each other.
Ultimately, the rivalry went dormant on the field when Missouri left the Big 12 Conference for the SEC in 2012. But the cultural memory, the manufactured, sponsored hatred, absolutely lingers in the region today.
It is a profound testament to how history is malleable. The past isn't dead. It is constantly being reshaped by the present.
Yeah.
It is shaped by our modern desire for entertainment, for a fierce tribal identity, and for a sense of belonging.
So let's bring this all together. We have taken an incredible journey today through the pages of Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We started by looking at Upper South settlers bringing the creeping vine of small-scale slavery into the muddy frontiers of western Missouri, relying on the brutal labor of hemp cultivation.
Right.
We watched as political tension over popular sovereignty erupted into a Hobbesian nightmare, a literal war of all against all, where the rule of law evaporated, women stitched ammunition pockets into beautiful shirts, and men looked for the shadows of hell on the faces of their victims.
Truly dark times.
We saw enslaved people refuse to be passive, using the chaos of the war to force their own emancipation, fleeing across frozen rivers and on stolen horses. We witnessed the deep hypocrisy of the Reconstruction era, where Kansas celebrated its moral superiority while hiding its own lynch mobs, and Missouri pushed for expulsion.
The messy reality of Reconstruction.
And finally, we saw how the darkest, most traumatic chapters of our past can be smoothed over, repackaged, and sold on a T-shirt for a college football game.
If we connect this broad historical sweep back to you, the listener, it demands a critical, unflinching look at your own surroundings.
Look at your own hometowns.
Exactly. Look at the historical narratives in your own region, your own community, your own state. The plaques in your parks, the names of your schools, the stories you tell yourselves about who you are. Are those local histories completely accurate? Or have they been selectively edited? Have the darker, more complicated, more shameful parts been smoothed over to make you feel better, or maybe just to sell you merchandise?
That is the exact thought I want to leave you with today. It's something to ponder long after this deep dive ends. If the most visceral, horrific neighbor-on-neighbor violence in American history, a war featuring scalping, arson, and mass murder, can be smoothed over and rebranded into a fun, sponsored marketing gimmick for college athletics in just over a century.
What's next?
Right. What current, deeply polarizing conflicts are we, right now, inadvertently laying the groundwork to commercialize for future generations? Will the tragedies we argue over today be the tailgate party slogans of tomorrow?
It's an unsettling thought, but history suggests our capacity to sanitize our own trauma for entertainment is stronger than we'd care to admit.
From the bloody mud of the Missouri River to the astroturf of Arrowhead Stadium, the X-ray machine of history is never as clear as we want it to be. The diagnostic waters are forever muddy. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.